Hi, my name's Walker DePuy. I'm a third-year icon and anthropology student, and my talk is entitled "The Political Ecology of Social Safeguards, Implications for Indonesia's Emerging REDD+ Landscapes." And this presentation comes out of work that I did during my icon internship, actually. In the summer of 2013, I spent 7 months working with the Center for International Forestry Research, based in West Java, Indonesia, where I worked with the team to investigate enabling conditions for communities to participate in forest carbon measurement, reporting, and verification. This research took me to a number of communities in the Mambramo Raya region of Papua province, which is the easternmost province in Indonesia. Specifically to communities in mangroves, communities on black sand beaches, and communities in lowland tropical forest. But it also exposed me to a moment that has stuck with me and currently animates my plans for research. So we began work in each village by bringing together communities and their elders for a series of meetings where we presented maps from a prior project's work and described our interests and intentions for upcoming research. One village that I've actually already shown here is broken up into 2 settlements across a mosaic of beach and mangrove swamps. And after explaining our research to them, we received both measured tones and pretty sharp rebuke. They wanted to understand what this thing called carbon was and how it relates to them. They wanted to know that we weren't working with neighboring mining companies who in decades past had channelized their land and destroyed large fishing areas in the process. They'd also heard stories of conservation NGOs collecting information and selling it to governments and private companies. And so before we continued any of our work, they said that they wanted to know as much as we do about carbon. And they wanted written assurance that we weren't going to sell our findings and profit from their words. This moment, for me, showed a community that had pride in their knowledge, a healthy distrust of outsiders, and a history of engagement that, while extending decades, was brought forcefully to bear in the present. A formal presentation and informal discussion about climate change and carbon occurred the next day with all the communities that we worked with, as well as a formal written assurance as requested. But to understand why we were in Mambramo and interested in communities in the first place, I should probably explain an emerging international policy called REDD+. REDD+ stands for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation, and it aims to slow down global climate change through the conservation of tropical forests, which harbor about 17% of global carbon emissions. By measuring and verifying the carbon stored in these forests, nations and communities that conserve them will theoretically receive financial compensation. It's a policy with a variety of actors, from multilateral organizations to national governments, civil society organizations, and corporations. And it's been called the strategic linkage between a climate change regime and international forest policy. This policy raises notable challenges, but it also offers striking opportunities, some argue. By focusing on climate change mitigation, forest conservation, and community development, it's been called a win-win-win strategy. Taken together, some authors argue that REDD+ could trigger the biggest paradigm shift in conservation history. It's also been heavily criticized. With its attachment to transnational financial markets, REDD+ has been accused of commodifying nature as the world's largest payment for ecosystem services experiment. Scholars argue that it prioritizes the value of carbon over their other ways of knowing and using the natural world, whether in terms of ecological processes or social relations. And as Eicher notes, by linking forests to the climate change debate, carbon storage became the central feature of tropical forests. So poised to create new carbonized conservation territories, this policy is a highly contested form of governance. At the same time, the architects of REDD+ understood all of this and recognized these critiques. And so they borrowed from international finance a risk management concept known as safeguards. A set of 7 safeguards were then formally instituted by the UNFCCC in the 2010 Cancun Accords. They've since been broken down into social and environmental categories. The idea being that these safeguards would make sure that biodiversity and local communities were not adversely impacted by the activities of REDD+. The first 5 are those most commonly understood to be associated with social concerns. As shown here, they range from an interest in transparent forest governance, to a respect for the knowledge and rights of Indigenous people, to full and effective participation. And while many argue that safeguards challenge the narrow idea of tropical forests as banks of carbon, and suggest that even though these mechanisms are a part of the REDD+ discourse, they bring ideas of legitimacy, equity, and social justice into the conversation. However, these mechanisms also face criticism of their own. Right now, as we can see, they're largely words on paper, or a screen in this case. And these words can be interpreted by different actors in different ways. And as REDD+ is a mixture of multilateral, national, civil society, and corporate actors, the priorities of those actors can shape how these safeguards are defined. This range of priorities has been shown to operate on a spectrum of values, from those focused largely on carbon, such as multilateral donors like the World Bank, to those instead more focused on non-carbon values, such as human rights, as is seen with many NGOs. This has often been seen to be a risk management strategy at the top, focused on do no harm to local communities, versus a more proactive attempt to do good. Throughout all of this, we see safeguards themselves are connected to larger questions of priority and value. That they're not neutral tools, but instead both complex and political, with people such as the World Bank, the UN, the World Wildlife Federation, and Conservation International trying to define and operationalize these ideas. This reality is not lost on researchers who argue that understanding the power relations that go into making these social safeguards is especially critical as these ideas grow in both scope and scale. And yet they also note that there's currently little attention to social safeguards, both critically and in terms of empirical research. Very few studies have actually talked to people about what they think about these things, how they're defining these things, how they hope to use these things, and what local communities even perceive them to be. All of this points to I argue, for a political ecology of social safeguards. That aims to trace how such safeguards are designed and enacted across multiple assemblages of actors, from the international to the local scale. And I'd argue that one question that has been missing from the discussion above is, how do social safeguards not simply legitimize the carbon territories that they're safeguarding against, but effectively define the boundaries of the social worth saving within them in the first place? This is especially important in a place like Indonesia, where many communities, as Anna Singh notes, for the forest landscape is social. By tracing how a concept such as full and effective participation or free, prior, and informed consent is envisioned and implemented across actors, from the World Bank to the Indonesian government, to national agencies, and down to local communities in Mambramo Raya, you can see a variety of things, such as how categories of what count as the social are created, how different actors conceive and translate these ideas, how different knowledge types might inform them or not, what is missing in these translations and travels, and lastly, whether a different framing of safeguards might make more sense. I think one possible place to start this discussion is the difference that Eicher makes between substantive and procedural safeguards. He defines substantive as the actual rights and duties articulated, and then procedurals are those processes that are set out to enforce those rights and duties. The idea being that words are not enough, and that procedural safeguards focus on the idea that interaction and results matter. The importance of consent and participation, as well as the difference between substantive and procedural safeguards, can be tied back to my opening story. In that story, we saw the role that history and past encounters played in defining expectations and setting precedent for future work. It's about legitimacy, but it's about more than that. Ethnography and experience remind us that these are relationships rather than regulations. Not clinical procedures, but instead intimate engagements, and engagements of trust. Tracing the creation and implementation of social safeguards and the translation of particular concepts across scales and sites of governance will call for an interrogation of what Anna Singh calls zones of awkward engagement, where words mean something different across a divide, even as people agree to speak. It might also allow a vision of safeguards in the words of Eicher as a first step towards a fairer dialogue between different knowledge systems. To close, I would argue that the country of Indonesia is an especially valuable place for this research. It holds the fourth largest forest carbon stock in the world, yet also has the highest deforestation rate currently globally. Thanks to a recent court case in 2013, indigenous land rights for the first time are potentially emergent, but also currently in limbo. And while there's a new RED agency at the national level specifically charged with implementing RED Plus policy, there's equally a new president that may be focused on shifting priorities from one on carbon to one that emphasizes smallholders and social justice. All of this suggests that the role of safeguards will be increasingly relevant to these discussions, giving all the more reason to understand them. In the end, I would argue that this work offers a window into current manifestations of transnational governance, insight into how safeguards are shaping and legitimizing conceptions of both landscapes and communities, how those communities and landscapes might in turn shape social safeguards, and lastly, lessons for how to create effective and equitable safeguard systems, and more importantly, the processes and relations that they rely on. So with that, I'd like to thank all the people and places that made this possible. And I'll take questions.
Any questions?
I guess I have a fundamental problem with RED. I really would like it to work, but what bothers me about it, if what we're really trying to do is store carbon, if that's the goal, well, I'm not sure an expanding mature forest is going to be the best way to do it. You know, you want something that's constantly accreting new carbon, so a young growing forest might be better. So some kind of an actual use of the forest might be more appropriate. Or a substitution. We found in Ecuador, for example, that native bamboo stored 7.6 times more carbon under soil than mature forest. So maybe switching to bamboo. Not that I think that would be great for biodiversity, but if we're all focused on carbon, then, you know, RED may not be the best metric. That's all I'm saying.
No, absolutely. And that was actually a pretty interesting part of the work that I was doing with C4. It was a project that, while tangentially applied to issues of RED, we very consciously made sure not to make it normatively about RED, especially given the fact that when you work with local communities, you recognize that the ways, as Ryan was talking about, that they institutionally structure their use and management of something like a forest in Indonesia brings all the more complexity to how you would work with communities to effectively maintain proper boundaries that actually allows for people to live in the places that you're trying to conserve.
How RED Plus is going to be effective in presence of palm oil?
Yeah, a lot of people are looking at that. I don't know if they have any answers yet. There are some real structural difficulties with balancing the economics of conserving forests with very large countervailing economic things, like from everything from mining to logging to palm oil. Yeah, I'm not very optimistic.